Vrek had seen many things in his long career as a diplomatic observer. He had watched the Murith collective sign a peace treaty after 80 years of war. He had stood in the ruins of the Sela homeworld after the Great Plague took half its people. He had sat in cold rooms with leaders who had just decided the fates of millions. None of it had shaken him. He was proud of that. He believed that a good observer felt nothing, only watched, recorded, and reported. That was before he met the humans. The space station called Meridian 7 floated in neutral territory between 4 different star systems. It was a busy place. Merchants, diplomats, travelers, and workers of a dozen different species moved through its wide corridors every hour. The air always smelled of engine oil and the different foods each species preferred. The noise never stopped. Vrek had been assigned here for 6 months to watch and report on the humans, who had only joined the Galactic Conclave 11 years ago. The Conclave wanted to understand them better. So they sent him. He watched the humans the way he watched everything, quietly, carefully, and without getting too close. The cargo vessel called the Ardent Star had docked at Meridian 7 3 days earlier. Its crew was small. 4 people. The captain was a man named Owen Tate, tall and broad-shouldered, with short dark hair and a calm face that did not give away much. His first mate was a woman named Nina Cole, quick and sharp-eyed, always moving, always checking something. The engineer was a heavy man called Lou Briggs, who spent most of his time under panels and inside machine compartments, talking to the ship's systems as if they were old friends. The ship's doctor was a woman named Kara Flynn, small and quiet, who Vrek had seen sitting in the station's common area reading a paper book, an actual paper book, while everyone else used digital screens. They were, by any measure, an ordinary crew doing ordinary work. The Ardent Star carried food and building supplies. Nothing important. Nothing dramatic. What caught Vrek attention was how they behaved when they were not working. Most species, when off duty on a neutral station, kept to their own kind. They ate together, talked together, stayed in familiar groups. Humans did not do this. Owen Tate had spent an evening playing a card game with a pair of deli traders and a retired Murith soldier, laughing at jokes Vrek was fairly sure did not translate properly into any language. Nina Cole had given half her meal to a young Sela worker who looked hungry, without being asked and without making anything of it. Lou Briggs had fixed a broken water pump in one of the station's lower maintenance rooms, a job that was not his responsibility, simply because someone mentioned it was broken. Kara Flynn had offered medical advice to 3 different people who were not her patients and not her species. Vrek wrote all of this down. He was not sure what it meant yet. He had read the official conclave reports on humans. The reports described them as moderately intelligent, biologically fragile, emotionally unpredictable, and prone to conflict among themselves. The reports said they were new to space travel on a galactic scale and should not be taken too seriously as a military or political force. The reports had a calm, dismissive tone that Vrek had always found reliable when it came to new species. Watching Owen Tate teach a deli child how to shuffle cards, he began to wonder if the reports had missed something. On the 4th day, the alert came. Vrek received it through the Conclave communication channel at the same time as every other diplomat and official on the station. A Shirak raider fleet, 40 ships, well-armed, experienced, had been detected moving toward the human colony world of Kessin 4. The Shirak were not new. They had been raiding frontier colonies for decades. They took what they wanted and enslaved who they could. The Conclave had never been able to stop them completely because the Shirak moved fast and struck targets that were too far from protected space to defend in time. Kessin 4 was one of those targets. The Conclave held an emergency session that same afternoon. Vrek attended as an observer. The session was efficient and cold. Speaker after speaker noted that Kessin 4 lay outside the protected zone. Sending Conclave forces would take too long and cost too much political capital. The colony had its own defense grid, modest, but something. The vote was taken. The Conclave would not intervene. It was not a cruel decision. It was simply a practical one. This was how large organizations survived, by making hard choices without letting emotion cloud the numbers. Vrek returned to the observation lounge afterward. He found himself looking for the humans. He spotted Owen Tate standing near one of the large viewport windows that looked out into open space. The captain was holding a small data screen showing the star map, Kessin 4 marked in red, the estimated position of the Shirak fleet marked in orange. Vrek could not see his face clearly. But he watched the man's shoulders, and he watched his hands, and he watched how still he went. It was not the stillness of shock. Vrek knew what shock looked like. This was something different. This was the stillness of a decision being made. Owen Tate stood at that window for perhaps 4 minutes. Then he put the data screen in his pocket, turned around, and walked back toward the Ardent Star's docking bay. He did not run. He did not look panicked. He looked like a man who knew where he needed to be and was going there. Vrek stayed by the window for a moment longer. Something small and uneasy had settled in the back of his mind. He had observed hundreds of species receiving bad news. He knew the signs of denial, of grief, of anger, of acceptance. He did not know what to call what he had just seen on Owen Tate's face. He picked up his notes and followed at a distance, telling himself he was simply doing his job. Nina Cole was waiting at the docking bay entrance when Owen arrived. She took one look at him and said something low that Vrek could not hear. Owen answered. Whatever he said made her nod once, a sharp, certain nod, and turn back toward the ship. Lou Briggs appeared from somewhere inside the docking corridor, wiping oil from his hands. Cara Flynn was already on board. The cargo bay door began to close. Vrek stood in the corridor and watched them. He thought about the conclave report that said humans were emotionally unpredictable. He wrote in his notes, "They are not unpredictable. They are simply operating on a logic I do not yet fully understand." Then he went back to his office and started reading everything he could find about what human crews had done in situations like this before. He read through the night. By morning, he was no longer calm. The Ardent Star left without filing a single piece of departure paperwork. On most stations, that would have triggered an automated hold, a lock on the docking clamps until the proper forms were submitted. On Meridian 7, someone in the station's administrative office quietly released the clamps anyway. Vrek checked the logs later and found the release had been authorized by a low-level port official named Ray Dunn, a human, who had filed the minimum required notes and then clocked out early. 3 other ships followed the Ardent Star within the hour. The Greystone was a mining hauler, wide and slow, built to carry rock and ore across long distances. Its captain was a man named Dale Marsh, heavyset and quiet, who Vrek had seen once eating alone at the station's food hall. The Linden was a survey vessel, used for mapping and scientific work, captained by a woman named Sandra Holt, who kept her hair pulled back and spoke with the clipped precision of someone who had spent years working in the silence of deep space. The Pale Rider was different from the others, a courier vessel, smaller and faster, but with what Vrek now recognized as non-standard modifications along its hull. Its captain was a man named Pete Garza, lean and dark-eyed, who had spent his time on Meridian 7 mostly avoiding the common areas. For civilian vessels heading toward a Shirak raider fleet of 40 warships. Vrek requested access to the human communication channels through his diplomatic clearance. It took 20 minutes for the approval to come through. He put on his listening equipment and sat down at his desk. He expected panic. Or grief. Or perhaps the desperate, overlapping voices of people trying to talk each other out of a very bad idea. What he heard was a supply inventory check. Nina Cole was speaking in a steady, even voice, reading off numbers. Ammunition counts. Medical supplies. Emergency ration units. Backup power cells. She read each number and Owen Tate confirmed it, and someone, Vrek thought it was Lou Briggs, occasionally interrupted to note that a particular item was lower than listed because he had used some of it for repairs during the last run. There was no music in their voices. No fear. They sounded the way workers sound when they are doing a job they have done many times before. On the channel that included all 4 ships, Dale Marsh of the Greystone spoke in short sentences. He had 4 external cargo containers that could be repurposed as cover if they needed to create a debris field. He wanted to know if that was useful. Owen said yes and told him where to position them. Sandra Holt reported that the Linden carried a full sensor suite originally meant for geological surveys. With some adjustments, it could be used to track ship movements in real time. Pete Garza said nothing for a long stretch and then asked a single question about the Shirak fleet's last known heading, noted the answer, and went quiet again. They were not talking like people heading into a disaster. They were talking like people solving a problem. Vrek sat back in his chair and stared at the wall. He had been in the Conclave's diplomatic service for 30 years. He had observed many military operations and many crises. He knew the difference between bravery and recklessness. Bravery meant doing the right thing even when it was hard. Recklessness meant doing a dangerous thing without properly understanding the danger. What he was hearing on those channels was neither of those things exactly. The humans understood the danger. They were counting it, measuring it, planning around it. They were simply not allowing it to be the deciding factor. That was what he could not place. In every other species he had studied, danger had weight. It pressed down on decisions and changed them. These humans seemed to have found a way to set it to the side, not to ignore it, but to refuse to let it steer. He was still thinking about this when a new piece of information arrived. A human conclave attaché named Greg Larson had sent a message through a secure diplomatic channel to what the header listed as the Human Colonial Defense Coordination Network. The message was short. It gave the location of the Shirak fleet, the estimated time of arrival at Kessin 4, the number of enemy vessels, and the names of the 4 civilian ships already in transit. It ended with 4 words: support is being requested. Vrek stared at those 4 words for a long time. He ran a search on the Human Colonial Defense Coordination Network. It was not listed in any of the Conclave's official records of human military infrastructure. There was no mention of it in any public document. It appeared nowhere in the Conclave's intelligence reports on human military capability, which Vrek had read carefully just the night before. 6 hours after Greg Larson sent his message, 2 warships departed from a location on the edge of human space that the Conclave had classified as a small refueling depot. The ships were not small. One was a carrier-class vessel that the humans called the Iron Meridian. The other was a destroyer called the Lance of August. Both were moving fast, on a direct course for Kessin 4. Vrek reported this to his superiors immediately. The response came back within the hour. His supervisor, a senior official named Drell of the Murith Collective, reviewed the information and concluded that it did not change the fundamental situation. 40 Shirak warships against 4 civilian vessels and 2 human military ships, the math remained unfavorable. The Conclave's decision stood. They would not intervene. Drell added, at the end of his message, that Vrek should continue monitoring and report on the outcome. The tone of the message was the tone of someone who already knew the outcome and considered it unfortunate but settled. Vrek sent back a short acknowledgement. Then he sat at his desk for a while longer, not writing anything. He thought about Nina Cole reading off supply numbers in that calm, steady voice. He thought about Pete Garza asking one quiet question and then saying nothing else. He thought about the Human Colonial Defense Coordination Network that did not exist in any Conclave record. He thought about the fact that a refueling depot had apparently been housing 2 warships. He opened a new file and began writing. Not his official report, that would come later. This was something else. Notes for himself. Questions he did not yet have answers to. The first question he wrote was simple: how many other things do we not know about them? He did not write an answer, because he did not have one. But the question sat at the top of the page and looked back at him, and he found he could not quite close the file and set it aside the way he normally set things aside when the facts were unclear. He left it open and kept watching the communication channels, waiting to see what the humans would do next. Vrek had never watched a battle from the inside before. He had read reports and seen recorded footage, but those were always cleaned up, organized, cut into something that made sense after the fact. What he watched through the sensor relay on the Iron Meridian's external array was raw and messy and hard to follow. He had spent 2 days getting access to that relay. It was technically permitted under the Conclave's emergency observation protocols, which allowed diplomatic observers to attach to non-conclave military operations for the purpose of accurate reporting. The human fleet commander, a woman named Admiral Gracepool whose face he never actually saw, had approved the request with a single-word reply: fine. He had set up his monitoring station in a small room on Meridian 7 that the station staff used for communications relay work. It had 3 screens, a narrow chair, and a smell like recycled air and old metal. He sat in that chair for 11 hours before the Shirak fleet reached Kessin 4. The Kessin 4 defense grid opened fire first. Vrek watched the energy signatures on his screen, the colony's ground-based cannons and the 3 small patrol ships that made up its entire standing defense, lighting up like sparks against the darkness. The Shirak fleet answered with the slow, heavy confidence of something that had done this many times and knew how it ended. The colony's defenses were holding, but only barely, and the numbers were simple. What the colony had would not be enough. Then the humans arrived. They did not arrive the way Vrek expected. He had assumed they would drop out of faster-than-light travel at a safe distance, the standard approach, used by every military force in the Conclave, because dropping into real space too close to other ships or to a gravity well was considered an unacceptable risk. The margin for error was almost nothing. If the calculation was even slightly wrong, a ship could materialize inside another ship, or inside a rock, or at an angle that tore it apart on arrival. The Iron Meridian dropped out of faster-than-light travel directly inside the Shirak formation. Not near it. Inside it. Close enough that Vrek screen showed the Shirak ships scrambling in every direction, their formation collapsing in an instant, their communication channels erupting with signals that his translation software rendered as something between surprise and something that had no clean word in his language but meant roughly, "This is not supposed to happen." The Iron Meridian was already firing before its drive fields had fully collapsed. The Lance of August came in at a different angle, 30 seconds later, and began moving through the chaos in patterns that Vrek could not predict. He had studied Conclave military tactics. He understood flanking, covering fire, pressure lines, withdrawal positions. The Lance of August was not doing any of those things in any way he recognized. It was moving closer when logic said to move back. It was taking hits. Vrek watched the damage alerts lighting up on the sensor feed, and continuing on the same path as if the hits were not a reason to change direction. 3 of the Shirak ships turned to focus their fire on the Lance of August. Any ship in the Conclave's fleet, faced with that kind of concentrated fire, would have pulled back to create distance. The Lance of August turned toward them. Vrek put his hand flat on the desk in front of him and pressed down. He needed something solid to hold on to. On the other side of the battle, the 4 civilian ships had come in around the edge of the fighting. They were not warships. They had no military shielding, no military weapons systems, no military anything. The Greystone was still shaped like a rock carrier. The Linden still had its survey antenna arrays. And the Ardent Star, Owen Tate's cargo vessel, had 4 weapons pods bolted to its outer hull in a way that any military engineer would have described as improvised at best. Vrek pulled up the close feed on the Ardent Star. Lou Briggs had rerouted the engine plasma through what appeared to be a hand-built forward weapons lance, a tube of metal and salvaged parts that ran along the ship's lower hull. On the sensor feed, Vrek could see the heat build up along the tube each time it fired. The heat was enormous. Too much, by any reasonable standard. The kind of heat that could cause a cascade failure in the ship's power systems. Lou Briggs kept firing. On the communications feed, Vrek caught fragments. Cara Flynn's voice, clear and unhurried, coming through from what his sensor data said was the ship's medical bay. She was talking Lou through the heat tolerances. She gave him numbers. She told him when to pause and let a section cool. She had an earpiece in and she was cross-referencing the ship's engine data while Vrek checked the secondary sensor, while she also laid out surgical equipment on a preparation table. She was doing both things at the same time. Keeping someone alive in a fight and preparing for the people who would need care after. Her voice did not shake. Her pace did not change. Vrek found he was holding his breath. The Ardent Star came in low under a Shirak command vessel, the largest ship in the enemy fleet, the kind of ship that directed everything else, and Lou's plasma lance fired 3 times in quick succession. The second shot hit something important. Vrek watched the command ship's power readings on his screen drop sharply, and then the entire Shirak fleet's communication pattern changed. The coordinated attack fell apart. Ships that had been working together started making independent decisions, and independent decisions in a chaotic battle were slower and less effective than coordinated ones. Owen Tate had known that. He had aimed at the brain of the fleet. The battle lasted 31 minutes from the moment the Iron Meridian arrived. Vrek counted every one of them. By the end, 19 Shirak ships were destroyed, 14 had fled, and 7 had surrendered. The Kessin 4 colony was damaged but standing. Its people were alive. The Lance of August was badly hurt. It would need months of repair. The Ardent Star had a section of its hull that had partially melted from the heat of Lu's plasma lance. Every ship had taken some damage. Not one human ship had been lost. VrekaAL sat in the small communications room for a long time after the sensor feeds went quiet. The screen still showed data, position reports, damage assessments, the slow movement of the surviving ships, but the noise of the battle was gone and the room felt very still. He thought about how the Iron Meridian had dropped in directly inside the Chirac formation. He thought about the Lance of August turning toward 3 ships that were firing on it. He thought about Cara Flynn's voice, steady and practical, talking about heat tolerances while she set out surgical tools. He thought about the official conclave report on humans. Biologically fragile, it had said. He stared at the wall and tried to make that description fit what he had just watched. He could not do it. He opened his notes and wrote one line: "They are not fragile. They simply do not treat their own fragility the way other species do." He closed the file. He needed to go to Kessin 4 and see it for himself. Kessin 4 was a colony world in the way that many human colony worlds were, not grand, not finished, still in the middle of becoming something. Low buildings spread across a wide plain, surrounded by farmland that stretched to the hills on 3 sides. The sky was a pale blue-gray, and when VrekaAL stepped off the relief vessel that had carried him here, the air smelled of turned soil and something burnt from the battle debris that was still being cleared from the colony's outer defense line. He had expected a celebration. Or at least the loud, disorganized relief of people who had just survived something terrible. He had seen that before on other worlds: the noise, the tears, the embraces, the shouting. Humans were supposed to be emotional. The conclave report said so repeatedly. What he found was people working. The main landing field had been converted into a supply distribution point. Crates of food and medicine and building materials were being sorted and moved by teams of colonists and crew from the relief vessels. Children were being checked by medical staff. A group of older colonists were marking the damaged buildings with colored tags: red for unsafe, yellow for reparable, green for intact, moving through the settlement in a systematic way that looked more like a planned operation than something they had organized in the last few hours. VrekaAL found Owen Tate at the edge of the landing field, standing next to a tall woman named Beth Okafor who appeared to be running the supply coordination. Owen had his left arm in a brace, a shrapnel injury from the hull breach the Ardent Star had taken during the battle. He was arguing with Beth. Not angrily. Practically. He was pointing at a crate and telling her that the anti-infection agents inside it needed to go to the children's medical station first, not to the general supply store, because children were more vulnerable to the kind of secondary infections that spread after a crisis when clean water was disrupted. Beth was telling him she had a distribution plan and the plan accounted for that. Owen said the plan needed to account for it more. Beth gave him a look that suggested she dealt with people like him often and had developed effective strategies for managing them. Owen adjusted his position, held up one hand, and agreed to let her handle it. Then he picked up a smaller crate with his good arm and started carrying it in the direction she had pointed. VrekaAL watched him go. He thought about the last time he had seen that man, standing at the window on Meridian 7, looking at a star map. 4 days ago. In those 4 days, Owen Tate had organized a response to a military crisis, crossed a significant stretch of space in a cargo vessel, flown that vessel into the middle of a battle, taken a hull breach and a shrapnel wound, and was now arguing about supply logistics with a relief coordinator. He was not thinking about the battle anymore. He had moved on. VrekaAL spent 3 days on Kessin 4. He interviewed people carefully, the way he always did, with patience and without leading questions, letting people talk until they arrived at what was actually on their minds. He spoke to Lou Briggs, who was helping the colony's engineering team assess the damage to 3 of the outer defense towers. Lou described the battle the way someone might describe a difficult job that had required some creative problem-solving. The plasma lance had been his idea, built from parts that were technically meant for something else entirely. He said it had worked better than he expected in some ways and worse in others, and that next time he would make a different set of adjustments. He said the heat buildup had been a real concern and that Kara had kept him focused when he started worrying about it. He said this without particular drama, as if being talked through heat tolerances by the ship's doctor while firing an improvised weapon at an enemy warship was something that required acknowledgement but not extensive discussion. VrekaAL asked him if he had been afraid. Lou thought about it for a moment. He said yes, he had been afraid, but that the fear had been less loud than the list of things that needed to be done, and so he had kept doing things. He seemed to consider this a complete and sufficient answer. He went back to examining a damaged power coupling. Vrek spoke to Nina Cole, who had spent most of the battle managing the Ardent Star's shield distribution from a manual backup panel because the automated systems had been damaged in the first exchange of fire. She described this as annoying but manageable. She had a small cut above her left ear that had been cleaned and sealed but not fully treated. She noticed Vrek looking at it and said Kara had wanted to do a proper closure, but there had been other priorities and it would be fine. He spoke to Sandra Holt of the Linden, who was quietly proud of the way her survey sensors had functioned as a real-time tracking system during the battle. She said she had been running calculations on that possibility for 2 years, ever since she read a technical paper about sensor adaptation in contested environments. She had never expected to test it in an actual fight. She said it was good to know it worked. Then Vrek walked to the edge of the settlement, past the last row of tagged buildings, and found a small farm that had not been significantly damaged. A man was sitting on a low wall outside the main structure, drinking something warm from a metal cup. His name was Cal Rourke, and he had farmed this land for 9 years. His family, a wife and 2 children, had spent the battle in an underground shelter beneath the farmhouse. They were fine. The farm was fine. A section of fence had been knocked down by debris from one of the Chirac ships, but that was the worst of it. Vrek sat down nearby and asked Cal how he was feeling. Cal considered the question. He said he was tired, and a little shaky, and that his youngest had not slept properly since the night of the battle, and that was the part that bothered him most. Then he looked out at his field and said they had been lucky the crops were past the fragile stage, because a bad enough shockwave from the fighting could have set the harvest back badly. Vrek asked him if he had known help was coming. Cal looked at him. The look was not impatient. It was simply the look of someone for whom the question had an answer so obvious that the need to ask it was slightly puzzling. He said, "They sent out the call. Of course people came." Vrek sat with that for a moment. He asked Cal to say more about what he meant. Cal put his cup down on the wall beside him. He said that when you lived out on a frontier world, you knew the rules. You kept your shelter in order. You knew your neighbors. You helped when help was needed. And when you were in trouble, you sent out the call, because that was what the call was for. He said the 4 ships that came first and the 2 warships after them were just people who heard the call and came. That was how it worked. Vrek asked whether he had been surprised by how fast they came, by how far they traveled. Cal picked his cup back up. He said no, not really. He said that was just people being people. That night, Vrek sat alone in a small office that a colony administrator had loaned him. The room had a window that looked out over the plain, and in the darkness he could see the lights of the team still working on the outer structures, small points of yellow light moving in the distance, unhurried, steady. He opened his official report file. He had been adding notes to it for days. Now he needed to write something coherent, something his superiors would be able to read and understand. Something that explained what he had seen. He stared at the blank page for a long time. The problem was not that he lacked information. He had collected more information than he had expected. The problem was that the information kept pointing at something he did not quite have the right words for. He had words for bravery and sacrifice and loyalty. He had clinical terms for risk tolerance and psychological resilience. None of them fit exactly. He thought about Nina Cole, singing softly during the battle. Not to calm herself down. She had already been calm. Just singing a song she liked, in the middle of everything. He thought about Cal Rourke saying, "That's just people being people." He wrote one line at the top of the page and stopped. The line read, "They do not fight because they are not afraid. They fight because there is something that matters more to them than the fear." He read it back. It was not quite right either. But it was closer than anything else he had written. He kept it, and started from their point 6 months after the battle at Kessin 4, Vrek stood in front of the Galactic Conclave High Chamber and gave his report. The High Chamber was an old room. The walls were dark stone, carved with the symbols of every founding species. The seats were arranged in a wide arc, tiered from floor to ceiling, and every seat was filled. Senior delegates, advisors, military observers, and scientific representatives had gathered from across the conclave. Some were there because they had been officially summoned. Some had come because word had spread that this particular report was going to be different from the usual kind. They were right about that. Vrek began with the facts. He was a precise man and he gave the facts precisely: the timeline of the Chirac raid, the conclave's decision not to intervene, the human response, the battle itself, its outcome, and what he had found on Kessin 4 after. He spoke without emotion and without exaggeration. He let the numbers and the events stand on their own. The chamber was quiet. Not the polite quiet of an audience waiting for the interesting part. The careful quiet of people paying very close attention. When he had finished the factual section, he paused. He set down the prepared document on the podium in front of him. He looked out at the chamber. He said that what he was about to tell them next was not in the official prepared report. It was in an addendum he had written himself, which they would all receive after this session. He said he was going to tell them what he believed the facts actually meant. A few delegates shifted in their seats. This was unusual. Observers reported facts. They did not typically stand in the high chamber and tell senior delegates what to believe. Vrek continued anyway. He said that in 30 years of diplomatic observation, he had studied 19 different species at various stages of development and crisis. He had observed wars and plagues and political collapses and recoveries. He had, he believed, a reasonable understanding of how intelligent species behaved under pressure. He said that understanding was what made what he had seen at Kessin 4 genuinely difficult to explain. He said the problem was not that humans were braver than other species, or stronger, or better at fighting. By many direct physical measurements, they were in fact not the most impressive species in the conclave. They were not the largest. They were not the fastest. Their biology was, as the report said, comparatively fragile. They needed a narrow range of temperatures, specific amounts of oxygen, a particular balance of nutrition and rest. The chamber stayed quiet. He said the problem, and he used the word problem deliberately, because that was what it was what happened inside a human being at the moment when the decision was made. When a human being decided that something mattered enough to act on, something else appeared to close off. The exits. The escape routes. The door in the mind where alternatives were stored. He had watched Owen Tate stand at a window and make that decision in silence, in about 4 minutes, and then simply begin moving. He had watched 4 civilian ships go through a supply check and a logistics discussion and then head toward 40 warships, not with the desperate energy of people doing something reckless, but with the focused efficiency of people doing something that had already been decided. He said that every other species he had studied performed a continuous calculation during a crisis. The calculation weighed cost against benefit, safety against risk, possible loss against possible gain. The calculation could be interrupted, updated, reversed. It was the thing that allowed most species to survive contact with bad odds. It was rational. Humans performed this calculation too. He had seen it. They counted ammunition and measured heat tolerances and assessed sensor ranges. They were not thoughtless or careless. But they had a second step that other species did not have. After the calculation, they asked, who needs us? And if the answer to that question was someone real, someone specific, someone whose face they could picture or whose name they knew, the calculation stopped mattering as much as the answer. He said he had thought for a long time about how to describe this accurately without making it sound either more romantic or more frightening than it actually was. In the end, he had settled on this: humans were not uniquely willing to die for something. Many species were. Humans were uniquely willing to stop treating their own survival as the primary condition of any plan. They folded it in as one factor among several, and sometimes the other factors outweighed it, and they proceeded anyway, not in a state of sacrifice but in a state of simple priority. An elder delegate from the Murith Collective asked whether this meant humanity should be considered a threat to conclave stability. Vrek answered carefully. He said no, not to any species or institution that was genuinely on their side. The humans he had observed were not aggressive. They did not start conflicts. They did not seek conquest. They went home after the battle and argued about supply inventories and fixed fence lines and worried about whether their children were sleeping enough. The danger that humanity represented was not the danger of ambition or cruelty. He paused. He said the danger was what happened if the conclave continued to make decisions the way it had made the decision on Kessin 4. He said that every human diplomat, every human captain, every human administrative staff member he had spoken to in the 6 months since that battle had been told what the conclave had decided and why. None of them had filed formal protests. None of them had issued public statements. They had simply noted it, in the quiet way that humans noted things, and adjusted accordingly. They had adjusted how much they expected from the conclave when it counted. They had adjusted what they were willing to share and what they were willing to trust. He said that was the thing that should concern the chamber most. Not human weapons or human tactics. The slow, steady process by which humanity was learning exactly how much the conclave's word was worth. The room was very quiet. He picked up his notes. He was almost done. He said he wanted to end with something small, because he believed small things were often the truest. He said that during the battle, on the Ardent Stars communication channel, Nina Cole had been singing a quiet song, something with a slow rhythm. She had been singing it while she ran targeting calculations. Not because she was trying to manage fear, she was already calm. Simply because she liked the song and it was something she did. He said that was the detail that had stayed with him more than any other. The fleet sizes, the tactics, the outcome, those could be analyzed and modeled and prepared for. But a person singing a song they liked in the middle of a fight, not as performance and not as coping, just as an ordinary thing a person does, that was something the conclave's models had not predicted and did not currently account for. He said, the universe has learned to whisper the word human the way it whispers the word death. Not because humans destroy without reason. But because once they have a reason, the result is rarely in question. And perhaps more importantly, they will always find a reason, because they are built around things that matter to them, and those things are never very far from their thoughts. He gathered his notes, thanked the chamber for its time, and stepped back from the podium. The room remained quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, the sound of the chamber returning to itself, chairs shifting, voices resuming, the ordinary noise of many people in one room, began to fill the space. But it was a different kind of noise than the room had held before. It was quieter. More careful. On the way out, Vrek passed a large viewport window that looked out at open space. He stopped for a moment and looked at it. Somewhere out there, Owen Tate was probably hauling cargo again. Cara Flynn was probably reading her paper book. Lou Briggs was probably talking to his engines. And the conclave was probably already writing a new assessment of what humanity meant for the balance of power in the galaxy. Vrek hoped they would get it right this time. He was not entirely confident that they would.